This is my true story. I spent my whole life raising my son, giving him food, shelter, and every comfort I could afford. I thought when I grew old, he would give me respect in return. But on my birthday, with candles still burning, he slapped me again and again, 15 times in front of his wife. My heart shattered, but I did not scream. I stayed silent because I already knew what I would do next. Before that, tell me where you're watching from and what time it is right now. And please subscribe so my story can reach more people. I was born with nothing, and I learned to fight with my bare hands against hunger, storms, and long nights. Every drop of sweat from my brow was not for myself, but for the boy I brought into this world. I worked in fields when the sun burned my back. I carried bricks when my knees were weak. I stood in the rain with tools in my hand when others rested. My body became old before its time. But I kept going because I had a dream that my son would never know the same pain I had known. Every coin I earned went into his future. When he was small, I carried him to school on my shoulders, even when I had not eaten myself. When he was sick, I sat by his bed and prayed all night, begging God to take my life instead of his. I starved so that he could eat. I wore torn shirts so that he could wear new ones. I walked miles in broken shoes so that he could ride in a car. I saved every penny and never bought myself comfort because I thought comfort belonged to him. When he wanted toys, I bought them even if it meant skipping meals. When he wanted new clothes, I worked extra shifts to afford them. When his classmates mocked him, I worked harder to give him pride. I told myself that one day he would look at me and say, "Father, thank you." That was my dream. Years passed, and my back bent lower under the weight of work. I watched him grow while I grew old. He ate well, studied in good schools, had a roof above his head, all because I broke my body to give him what I never had. I paid for his college, even when debt piled like stones on my chest. I took loans in my name, not his. I carried the shame of owing money so he could carry the pride of success. When he failed, I picked him up. When he fell, I paid the price. I gave him the house he now lives in, built with my hands, brick by brick, nail by nail. That house was meant to be a gift of love, not a prison of cruelty. I thought my sacrifices would mean safety in my old age. I thought my birthday would mean joy, that he would bring me cake and respect, that I would hear laughter and love instead of insults and blows. I dreamed that the boy I raised would remember the father who fed him, clothed him, sheltered him, and built him. But I was wrong. The sacrifices I made became invisible to him. He forgot the nights I worked without sleep, the meals I gave up, the pain I carried. He saw only an old man in his way, not the father who gave him everything. Still, I stayed silent. Still, I prayed that one day he would see. My whole life was a sacrifice, and every scar on my hands, every wrinkle on my face, every ache in my bones was proof of love. Love that was answered with cruelty I never thought possible. The first signs of cruelty did not come all at once like a storm. They came like drops of cold rain that I tried to ignore, believing the sun would return. At first, my son's words grew sharper. He no longer said thank you for meals I cooked or for the roof I built over his head. He would push his plate away and mutter that the food was not good enough. I told myself it was just stress, that life was heavy on him, and that a father should understand. But slowly, those words became blades. He called me slow when my hands trembled. He called me useless when I could not carry heavy bags like I once did. He laughed at my shaking fingers when I struggled to hold a cup of tea. I swallowed the insults and kept silent because I believed silence was strength. I hoped his heart would soften, that he would remember the days I carried him on my shoulders. But instead he grew colder. The kindness that once lived in his eyes turned into impatience. He looked at me as if I were a stranger taking up space in his home. He told his friends I was old trash. I heard him say it from the corner of the room, his voice cutting through me more than any knife could. I sat in my chair pretending not to hear, pretending my ears were weak. But inside my chest, I bled. The first time he refused to sit and eat with me, I felt the air shift. He ate alone in his room, and when I asked why, he said he could not stand the sound of my chewing. My chewing. the same mouth that once begged for food to feed him. He ordered me to eat faster, to stop being slow, to stop being in his way. I nodded and obeyed, like a servant in my own house. His friends would come over and laugh when he mocked me. "Look at him shake," he said, as if I were a clown. I lowered my eyes, pretending not to notice, because I thought it was better to let shame fall on me than to cause trouble for him. But each time I stayed silent, his cruelty grew stronger. Respect turned into arrogance, gratitude into scorn. He looked at my hands, the same hands that built his life, and told me they were good for nothing. He looked at my face, the same face that smiled at him every birthday, and told me I looked like a ghost waiting to die. I tried to pray, tried to tell myself that kindness would come back, but each day it slipped further away. I asked him once if he remembered the nights I worked while he slept, the mornings I skipped meals so he could eat, the years I gave up so he could stand tall. He rolled his eyes and told me the past did not matter. "You're old now. You can't even walk straight. What good are you?" he said. Those words crushed me, because they erased everything I had ever done for him. I became invisible in my own house. I lived like a shadow, careful not to disturb him, careful not to ask for anything. I thought maybe if I kept quiet, he would calm down, but silence only gave him more power. His cruelty became normal. His words became daggers. His voice became a whip that cracked across my back without mercy. Every insult piled on me like stones, and I carried them alone, because I believed he would one day wake up and remember I was his father. But I was wrong. The first signs of cruelty were not mistakes. They were warnings of the storm that was coming, a storm that would break my heart and tear away what little dignity I had left. It happened on the day that was supposed to remind me of love, a day I had once looked forward to each year, the day of my birth, the day I believed would carry at least a trace of respect, of remembrance, of gratitude from the boy I had raised. Instead, it became the darkest day of my life. I sat at the table with a small cake in front of me. I had bought it myself because no one else thought to. The candles flickered gently, and for a moment I closed my eyes and imagined my son walking in with kindness, imagined him saying, "Happy birthday, Father." But when I opened my eyes, I did not see kindness. I saw his face twisted in rage, his eyes cold, his mouth full of cruelty. He walked toward me not with love, but with hatred. And then his hand rose. The first slap came suddenly, hard across my face. It burned my skin, but more than that, it burned my heart. I told myself maybe it was anger, maybe it was stress, maybe it would end with that one strike. But then came the second slap. And the third. His hand fell again and again, each time louder, each time harder. My head jerked side to side as if I were a rag doll. By the fifth slap, my face stung, my ears rang, and my eyes watered, not just from pain but from betrayal. This was my son. This was the boy I had carried on my shoulders, the boy I had shielded from the storms, the boy I had prayed for in sickness. And now he stood in front of me delivering blows as though I were nothing. At 10 slaps, my face was swollen, my skin red, my lips trembling. I wanted to cry out, but my pride held me in silence. I stood there taking it, not because I was weak, but because I could not believe it was real. By 12, I staggered. The room spun, my knees shook, but I forced myself not to fall. I thought of the nights I had carried him when he was small, how he had once wrapped his little arms around my neck and called me the best father. Those memories shattered as his hand struck me again and again. 14, 15. The number echoed in my mind like a drumbeat of humiliation. 15 times my own son struck me across the face on the day I should have been honored. 15 times he reminded me not of love, but of cruelty. 15 times he carved into me a pain deeper than any wound, because each strike told me I was worthless to him. And the worst part was not just the slaps. The worst part was that he was not alone. His wife sat in the corner, watching, and instead of stopping him, instead of speaking for me, she laughed. A cold, sharp laugh, like a knife twisting in my chest. My humiliation was not private, it was entertainment. My suffering was not hidden, it was shared. I stood there, my cheeks red, my skin throbbing, my eyes blurred with tears, and I realized in that moment that I was no longer his father in his eyes. I was just an old man, an obstacle, a target for his rage. The cake sat untouched on the table. The candles burned down into wax. The air smelled of sugar and smoke, but the taste in my mouth was salt and blood. My birthday, once a day of joy, had become the funeral of my dignity. I thought of the birthdays I had given him. I remembered saving coins to buy him small toys when he was a child. Remembered working extra hours so I could afford the bike he wanted. Remembered cooking his favorite meals and singing for him when he was too young to even blow out the candles on his own. I remembered carrying him to bed after he had fallen asleep, his head resting on my shoulder, his small hand gripping my shirt. I remembered telling myself each year that all the pain, all the work, all the sacrifice was worth it if it meant he smiled on his birthday. And now, on mine, he gave me not smiles but slaps, not gifts, but humiliation. I could taste the betrayal more than the blood on my lips. I could feel the weight of 15 strikes more than the weight of my own years. It was not just violence, it was rejection. It was my son telling me with his hands and his hatred that I meant nothing to him, that I was not a father, that I was not a man, that I was worthless. And yet, even as my body trembled, even as my face burned, even as my heart shattered into 1,000 pieces, I did not fall. I stood in silence. I did not scream. I did not beg. I did not plead. Because deep inside me, something stronger than humiliation began to grow. A quiet fire. A decision forming in the ashes of my broken dignity. I realized then that my son had made a mistake. He thought 15 slaps had destroyed me. He thought his cruelty had ended me. But what he did not see, what he could not know, was that every strike only built a wall inside me, a wall of resolve, a wall that would lead me to do something he would never forget. The cruel act of 15 slaps was not the end of me. It was the beginning of his downfall. The room was quiet after the storm of his hands. The cake still sat on the table, candles burned into stubs, the sweet smell of sugar mixing with the bitter air of shame. I touched my face and felt the swelling, the heat of skin where his slaps had landed. My lips stung. My eyes blurred. The pain was sharp, but the silence was worse. It pressed down on me like a heavy stone, a silence that screamed louder than any word could. I sat in that silence, not as a father, not even as a man, but as a shadow of both. My body shook, but not from fear. It shook from the weight of betrayal. I had been beaten not by a stranger, not by an enemy, but by the boy I raised with my own hands. I stared at the flickering candles and thought of the years I had saved to buy him cakes. I thought of the times I had worked double shifts just so he could have toys and laughter. I thought of the birthdays when I had walked into the room carrying gifts with pride, watching his eyes shine with joy. Now, on my own birthday, I was the one left broken, and he was the one standing tall. I remembered one night when he was very small, maybe 6 or 7. A storm raged outside, rain beating hard against the windows. He was afraid, crying, clinging to me. I carried him to my bed, tucked him in, and held him close until he fell asleep. I whispered promises that I would always protect him, always keep him safe. And I meant it. My arms had been his shield. My chest had been his shelter. Now those same arms trembled, and that same chest ached, not from age, but from his cruelty. As I sat there, I could still hear his wife's laugh echoing in the background. That laugh was sharper than the slaps. It told me that my humiliation was not hidden, that it had been witnessed and enjoyed. I felt like I was no longer a man, but a spectacle, a weak old fool mocked in his own home. My face burned not only from the blows, but from shame, the kind of shame that seeps into your bones and stays there. I looked down at my hands, hands that were swollen and scarred from years of labor, hands that built the very house where this cruelty now happened. Those hands had once been strong enough to build walls, carry bricks, lift burdens. Now they shook, not from weakness, but from anger contained in silence. My silence was not cowardice. It was the silence of a storm waiting to break. The humiliation of that night did not end with the slaps. It followed me into the hours after. When I lay down to sleep, the sting on my cheeks burned against the pillow. Every blink of my swollen eyes reminded me of the blows. Every breath I took reminded me of the moment he stood over me, full of power, while I sat broken. My body remembered, but my soul remembered more. And yet, even in that humiliation, a strange fire began to grow. For the first time, I saw my son not as a child, not as someone I owed my life to, but as a man who had become cruel, arrogant, and blind. He thought those 15 slaps had reduced me to nothing. He thought his laughter and his wife's smirk had buried me in shame. But what he did not know was that shame can turn into strength, silence can turn into resolve, and humiliation can turn into revenge. That night, I lay in bed with tears rolling down my face, and I whispered to myself, "Enough." I realized my dignity had already been buried under his cruelty, and the only way to raise it back was to rise myself. He thought he owned me because I lived under his roof. He thought he broke me because he slapped me. But he forgot the truth, that the roof above his head, the car he drove, the accounts he used, all still belonged to me. My humiliation was real, but so was my power, and the silence he mistook for weakness would become the weapon that ended him. He thought slapping me 15 times had reduced me to nothing. He thought the sting on my face erased my history, my sacrifice, and my worth. But the truth was, his hands could only bruise skin. They could never erase the years of labor that had built everything he called his own. That night, as I sat in silence with pain across my cheeks, I began to remember what he had forgotten. As I tell you this story, I don't know how much time I have left in this world before I go back to my God. And I've seen it with my own eyes. When strength fades, respect disappears. One stumble, one fall, and suddenly they call you weak, a burden. That's why I made the Balance and Fall Prevention Guide for seniors. It's not fitness, it's protection. Just 10 minutes a day to stay steady, stay safe, and keep your independence. Download it now. The link is right below in the description. He forgot that the house he lived in was not his. Every wall, every nail, every roof tile had been paid for by me. My name was on the deed, not his. The very door he walked through each day existed because my hands had worked through nights and storms to give him shelter. He strutted through the halls as if he owned them, but the law said otherwise. He forgot the car he drove with such pride was not his. I had signed the papers. I had made the payments. His hands only touched the wheel because mine had signed the check. He sped down roads thinking he was free, but his freedom was built on the sweat of my back. That car was not a gift. It was a reminder of my sacrifice, and it still bore my name. He forgot the bank accounts he relied on were not his alone. He thought money came from the air. He thought food simply appeared on the table. But it was my decades of labor, my careful savings, my sacrifice of pleasure that filled those accounts. He never saw the nights I worked in pain, the days I went hungry so I could save. He only saw the result, a balance he thought belonged to him. He mocked me as worthless, yet my name was the one that gave him worth. As I sat there, bruises on my neck and cheeks, I realized the truth. I was not powerless. I still held the deeds, the signatures, the rights that truly mattered. His slaps had been cruel, his words had been poison. But in the silence of that night I saw clearly. The man he thought he destroyed still held the keys to everything. And that was the power he had forgotten. He thought strength was in fists and shouts. He thought respect was in mocking and control. But real power sat quietly in documents, in deeds, in the silent weight of ownership. He could not slap away the fact that I was still the one who built it all. The humiliation on my birthday was deep, but it opened my eyes. For the first time, I saw my silence not as weakness, but as a weapon. I saw my age not as a curse, but as proof of survival. And I saw his arrogance not as power, but as blindness. He had locked himself in a cage without knowing it, a cage built from his dependence on me. I whispered to myself that night, "He forgot the power that is still mine. He will remember it soon." That night, I lay in my bed with the sting of his hand still burning across my face. The swelling around my eyes made it hard to close them, but the real wound was not on my skin. It was in my heart. My son had crossed a line no child should ever cross. He had turned my birthday, a day of life, into a day of shame. And as I stared into the darkness, I knew something had to change. For years I had endured. I told myself patience was love. I told myself silence was strength. I convinced myself that the cruel words, the mocking laughter, the growing distance were just phases, storms that would pass. But after 15 slaps on the day of my birth, I could no longer hide behind excuses. This was not a storm that would pass. This was who he had become. A man who saw his father as worthless. A man who would raise his hand without guilt. A man who believed respect was dead. I lay there trembling, but my trembling was not just from pain. It was from the fire building inside me. The fire of decision. The fire of a man who had been pushed too far. I thought of all the years I had given him, all the sacrifices that had stolen from my own life to build his. I thought of the roof, the car, the bank accounts, the future he walked on as if it were his own. And I realized I had given him everything, and if I could give it, I could take it away. That thought settled in me like steel. I would not beg for kindness anymore. I would not wait for respect that would never come. I would not sit at his table like a shadow while he mocked me. My decision was simple, but it was final. I would vanish. I would disappear from his life the same way love had disappeared from his heart. But I would not go empty-handed. I would leave him with nothing. I would take back every key, every deed, every dollar, every shred of comfort that my sacrifice had given him. He would wake one day and discover that the man he thought was weak had silently taken away his empire. I did not plan to shout. I did not plan to argue. Arguments would only give him more chances to mock me. Instead, I planned silence, the silence of cold revenge. My decision was to leave without a word, without a note, without a glance back. He would not even hear the sound of my footsteps. All he would feel was the absence, the empty accounts, the locked doors, the missing keys, the quiet void of a father who had finally had enough. As I lay there, the pain on my face faded behind the clarity of my mind. For the first time in years, I felt strong. Not because my body was young. It wasn't. Not because my hands were steady. They shook. I felt strong because I had made a decision. A decision to no longer be the victim of my own love. A decision to reclaim the power he had forgotten I still held. That night, I whispered to myself, "He will not see me again. He will learn what it means to lose everything." And with that, I closed my swollen eyes and let the fire of resolve carry me into sleep. The morning after my birthday humiliation, the house was still. My son slept in his room, snoring with the arrogance of a man who thought he had won. He believed the 15 slaps had silenced me forever. He thought his cruelty had broken me into a servant who would endure anything. But as the light crept through the curtains, I rose with a new strength in my chest. My decision was clear, and now it was time to act. I moved slowly, careful not to wake him. My body ached from the beating, but my mind was sharper than it had been in years. I went to the drawer where I kept the keys. My hand trembled, but not from weakness, from the weight of what I was about to do. The ring of keys was still there, heavy in my palm. The house keys, the car keys, the safe deposit keys. Each one carried a story of my labor, each one proof that everything he enjoyed had come from me. I held them tightly, the metal pressing into my skin like reminders of the power he had forgotten. He thought his fists made him master, but these small pieces of metal told a different story. These keys were not just objects, they were control, access, ownership. They were mine. From there, I went to the old wooden box where I kept important documents. My fingers brushed over deeds, bank papers, account details. Every signature written in ink bore my name. The house he walked through, the money he spent, the car he drove, all of it was tied to me. I placed the papers in a small bag, one by one, each page a weapon sharper than any slap. The silence in the house was thick. The only sound was the faint rattle of the keys in my hand. Every jingle felt like a drumbeat of justice. He slept thinking the world was his, while I stood there reclaiming it. For years, he had laughed, mocked, and humiliated me, believing I had no power. But in that moment, I realized my power had never left. It had simply waited for me to pick it up again. I looked once more at the table where the cake still sat, the candles burned down into stubs. That cake had been a symbol of humiliation the night before, but now it became a symbol of transformation. Last night, I had been the victim. This morning, I was the one holding the keys. I slipped the bag over my shoulder, the weight of the papers and metal heavy but comforting. It was the weight of freedom, the weight of justice. I walked past his door without a glance. I did not need to see him. I did not need to hear his voice. The sound of the keys in my pocket was enough. When I stepped outside, the morning air hit my swollen face. It stung, but it also felt like a baptism, cold, clean, and new. For the first time in years, I felt the air of freedom. I locked the door behind me, turning the key slowly, firmly. That lock was not just wood and metal. It was a line drawn between me and him, between cruelty and dignity. He was still inside, sleeping in arrogance, but the world outside was mine again. I did not leave a note. I did not leave a word. My silence was the loudest answer I could give. He would wake and find the door locked, the keys gone, the accounts emptied, the deeds taken. He would learn, not from my shouting, but from my absence. The man he thought worthless had left with everything. The keys jingled in my pocket as I walked away, each sound a reminder. He struck me 15 times, but I was the one holding the future. The sun had barely risen when I stepped out of that house for the last time. My body was still aching from the blows, but my heart was no longer heavy. In my pocket, the keys rattled with every step, and in my bag, the documents and papers lay safe. Each sound, each weight reminded me that I was not walking away empty. I was walking away with everything that truly mattered. The street was quiet, only the chirping of birds breaking the silence. For a moment, I stood on the porch and looked back at the door I had just locked. It was the same door I had once carried him through when he was a boy, asleep in my arms after a long day. The same door I had walked through with bags of food, toys, and gifts, believing each step was building him a better life. Now, that door was closed to him. It was mine again, sealed behind the strength of my silence. I took a deep breath and stepped off the porch. Each step away felt like shedding chains that had bound me for years. My shoulders, once bent under the weight of humiliation, straightened a little more with every stride. The road stretched ahead, empty but free, and I realized that for the first time in decades, I was not walking toward responsibility. I was walking toward my own life. As I moved farther, I thought about what I was leaving behind. Not just a house, not just walls and furniture, but the years of humiliation, the nights of silence, the mornings of mockery. I was leaving behind the version of me that endured cruelty in the hope of love. That old man, bent and broken by his son's scorn, was gone. The man walking now was someone new, someone reborn in silence, hardened by betrayal, and strengthened by resolve. The keys jingled again, and I tightened my hand around them. They were no longer just keys. They were symbols of justice, symbols of the truth that I had never been powerless, only patient. He would wake up soon, stretch in arrogance, and walk to the door expecting to step into his kingdom. But he would find it locked. He would search for the car and find it gone. He would run to the bank and find only empty balances. He would scream, but there would be no answer because I had already left. My steps were slow but steady. Each one was deliberate, each one carrying me farther from the house that had become a prison. I passed by neighbors who glanced at me curiously, but I kept my head high. They had seen the slaps, heard the arguments, whispered about my humiliation. Let them see now the quiet dignity of my departure. Let them wonder where I was going. I did not need to explain. Silence was my reply. I walked until the house was no longer in sight. When I finally stopped and looked back, all I saw was distance. No roof, no windows, no chains. Just the open road ahead. My chest filled with something I had not felt in years. Freedom. Not the freedom of youth, but the freedom of an old man who had reclaimed his dignity. I whispered to myself as I turned my eyes forward, "He will never see me again." And with that, I kept walking, vanishing into a world that was mine once more. He woke up late, as he always did, thinking the world was still under his control. The arrogance on his face was the same as the night before, when he raised his hand against me 15 times. He stretched, yawned, and walked toward the door, expecting the house to open for him like it always had. But when he turned the handle, it did not budge. The door was locked. Confusion spread across his face. He tried again, jiggling the handle harder, then slamming his shoulder against it. Nothing. For the first time, the door he thought belonged to him would not open. Panic set in quickly. He called for me, shouting my name, but the house answered only with silence. He searched the rooms, opening closets, looking for me, but I was not there. The cake on the table, melted candles dripping wax down the sides, was the only reminder of the night before. The humiliation he had left me with had turned into the humiliation waiting for him. He rushed to the garage, expecting to find the car, but the space was empty. The floor where the tires once sat now stared back at him like a mirror of loss. His voice cracked as he shouted again, this time angrier, this time louder, but still, there was no answer. His fists hit the walls, but fists could not bring back what silence had taken away. Desperate, he grabbed his phone and called the bank. His voice, once full of command, now shook as he demanded his balance. The clerk's calm reply cut deeper than any slap he had given me. "Sir, the account is empty. All funds have been withdrawn." He froze, his hand gripping the phone so tightly it turned white. He asked again, louder this time, but the answer was the same. Zero. Nothing. Every dollar he thought was his had already been taken, signed out by the man he called worthless. He stormed to his wife, shouting, blaming her, but she had no answers. Together they tore through drawers, searched papers, checked safes, but everywhere they looked, the truth stared back. Empty. Locked. Gone. His voice, once sharp with arrogance, now cracked with desperation. He screamed into the silence of the house, but no scream could open a locked door or refill an empty account. Neighbors began to whisper. They had seen me leave at dawn. They had watched me walk with my bag and my silence. Now they watched him, pacing like a trapped animal inside the house he thought was his. The same neighbors who once heard his laughter at my expense now murmured about his downfall. They spoke of karma, of justice, of a father finally standing up after years of cruelty. His pride began to rot under the weight of their stares. Days passed, and the panic grew worse. He went to the bank in person, but the answer was the same. Nothing remained. He went to the courthouse, demanding documents, but the papers were already in my possession. He called relatives, begging for help, but they had heard what he had done on my birthday. No one wanted to help the son who slapped his father 15 times. Respect, once lost, does not return. The house, once full of arrogance, became full of emptiness. He wandered its halls like a ghost, but the walls did not answer. The car was gone. The money was gone. The father he mocked was gone. And in their place was silence, a silence heavier than any chain, a silence that reminded him every day that cruelty has a price. His wife, once amused by my humiliation, began to turn cold. She saw the truth. The wealth she had enjoyed was not his, but mine. And now that I was gone, she saw only a man stripped of power. Arguments filled their nights, and soon, even her laughter disappeared. He was left alone, abandoned, carrying nothing but shame. The man who once believed slaps made him powerful now stood broken, powerless, and desperate. My silence had done what words never could. It had destroyed him. When I walked away that morning, I carried no anger in my steps. The bruises still hurt. The memory of the 15 slaps still burned, but my heart was lighter than it had been in years. I had taken back what was mine, not just the house, not just the car, not just the money, but my dignity. For too long I had lived in silence, hoping my son would change, waiting for kindness that never came. Now I was free, and the silence was no longer a cage. It was my shield. I rented a small place in another town, nothing grand, nothing loud, just enough for peace. With the money I withdrew, I secured my future. No more depending on him, no more waiting for his hand to feed me. I had fed him all his life. Now I would feed myself. I cooked my own meals, ate at my own table, and for the first time in years, every bite tasted like dignity. I began to live again. I walked in the park, and no one mocked my trembling hands. I sat on benches, and no one called me useless. I greeted strangers, and they greeted me back with respect, not scorn. Slowly the bruises on my face faded, but the scars in my heart healed even faster. Because every day I reminded myself, I had escaped, and I had left him with nothing. Back in the house I once built, the story was different. Word spread quickly among relatives and neighbors. They whispered about the son who slapped his father 15 times, about the man who mocked the hands that raised him, about the cruelty that had turned against him. Respect vanished from his life. Neighbors who once smiled now turned away. Relatives who once visited stopped coming. His wife grew colder, tired of living with a man who had nothing. The wealth that once kept her by his side had disappeared with me. Soon, even she left, taking with her the last trace of his pride. I did not watch his downfall directly. I did not need to. The silence between us told me enough. I knew he was suffering, not from my hand, but from the weight of his own choices. He had thought himself strong when he slapped me 15 times. But strength is not in cruelty. Strength is in control, in patience, in silence. And my silence had stripped him of everything. I lived in peace, surrounded not by riches, but by dignity. Each morning, I opened my window and let the sun touch my face, free of fear, free of humiliation. I did not need a grand house or applause from others. All I needed was the knowledge that I had reclaimed my life. My son, the one who had mocked me, could no longer reach me. His calls went unanswered, his messages ignored. He had become a stranger to me, a stranger left with nothing but guilt and emptiness. And as I sit here now telling this story, I realize the greatest revenge was not in the money I took or the keys I carried, but in the peace I found after leaving. He will never see me again. He will live with the memory of what he did and the silence of what I became. That is justice. That is freedom. Final thought. On my birthday, he slapped me 15 times. I took the keys and vanished forever. He never saw me again. Before I end, let me tell you, I don't know how much time I have left in this world before I go back to God. That's why I made the Balance and Fall Prevention Guide only for you, so you can stay steady, safe, and independent. Download it now. The link is in the description.